The door wasn't locked when we found it the next morning. None of us opened it, though, because the muddy footprints leading out were ours. Every last one of us swore we had locked it tight. But somehow, we let something in. It all started as a quick getaway to unplug from the world. Jack, Emily, Rachel, and I rented a secluded cabin deep in Minnesota's woods. A creaky old thing buried in a grove of pine trees. The place looked inviting enough in the photos. Rustic wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and miles of forest between us and the nearest neighbor. In person, though, the cabin felt wrong, too quiet, like the trees were holding their breath listening. We got there late in the afternoon, hauling our stuff inside, just before the sun dipped behind the trees. The forest seemed to wrap around the cabin like a cocoon, muffling sound. Jack joked that we'd get great sleep out here. But even then, I couldn't shake the sense that we were intruding on something. We tried to make the best of it that evening. A fire crackled in the hearth, and we lounged around it with beers and snacks. The hours passed, but none of us could fully relax. Every so often, one of us would glance at the window, catching fleeting movements just beyond the glass. Probably animals, we told ourselves. Except the shadows didn't seem to belong to anything with 4 legs. Things got worse after Emily discovered the graves. She'd gone to pee behind the cabin and came back pale as a sheet. "There's something buried back there," she whispered, like saying it aloud would make it worse. Jack and I want to check, have to prove her wrong, have to convince ourselves it was nothing. We found them in a row, half buried beneath dead leaves, 4 old markers. Their inscriptions faded to near invisibility. Only one word was clear: found. The same word on each marker. No names. No dates. Emily tried to laugh it off. "So what? It's an animal cemetery?" she said, but her voice shook. No one laughed. Later that night, as the fire dwindled to embers, I drifted in and out of sleep on the couch. The silence felt thick and unnatural, like the forest had closed in around us. Then came the noise, soft at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was Jack moving around, but then I saw him, sound asleep on the other side of the room. The sound was coming from the attic. Slow, deliberate steps, pacing back and forth above us. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. We hadn't gone upstairs. Hell, there wasn't supposed to be an attic at all. The rental listing hadn't mentioned one. I woke the others. We stared at the ceiling, listening as the footsteps stopped directly above the fireplace, like something was waiting, listening. Jack grabbed the flashlight, but it flickered and died as soon as he clicked it on. He cursed under his breath, but even in the dark, I could see the fear in his eyes. Then, just as suddenly, the front door creaked open. Not a burst, not a slam, just a slow, deliberate swing, as if someone was inviting us out. That was when we ran. None of us stopped until we were in Jack's car, speeding down the dirt road with the forest blurring past. We told ourselves it was the wind, that old wood shifts at night. We wanted to believe that so badly. But when we came back the next morning to grab our forgotten bags, the front door was wide open again. And then we saw them, the muddy footprints, identical to our own, leading from the cabin door back into the forest. The storm rolled in fast, sheets of rain tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. The sky looked angry, clouds twisting into bruised smears above the trees. I was alone in the house. My parents had rushed out earlier, something about a work emergency, promising they'd be back soon. I'd been alone before, but tonight, it felt like the walls were pulling closer, like the house knew something I didn't. I curled up on the couch, flipping through channels, but nothing held my attention. The room was too dark, the rain too loud. Even the TV couldn't drown out the nagging feeling that something was wrong. And then I heard it, a knock at the door. It was quick, deliberate, just 3 taps sharp against the wood. I stared at the door for a moment, waiting to see if it would come again. It did, a little harder this time. When I opened the door, she was standing there, the woman from down the street. I'd seen her a few days ago when she moved in, quiet, polite, nothing strange. But now, in the rain, something was off. Her soaked hair clung to her face, and her clothes dripped puddles onto the porch. But it wasn't the water that made my stomach turn. It was her smile. It stretched too wide, like she'd practiced it too many times. Her eyes didn't match it. They stayed cold and still, locked onto me. "Are you alone?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than the rain. The question sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to lie, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, slow and unsure. Her smile twitched slightly at the edges, and then she tilted her head, studying me like she'd just solved a riddle. Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as if she'd never been there at all. I slammed the door, my heart racing. The lock clicked under my trembling fingers, but the house still didn't feel safe. Something was off, and I could feel it now more than ever, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I tried to tell myself she'd just been checking in, making sure I was okay. But the storm seemed quieter now, the rain muffled, and the house sat too still around me, like it was holding its breath. I went back to the couch, curling up again, but I couldn't focus on anything. Every creak of the house felt deliberate. Every gust of wind against the windows felt too precise. I glanced at the door every few minutes, expecting her to knock again. She didn't. But just as I started to relax, I heard footsteps. They came from above, slow and deliberate. The floorboards in my parents' bedroom groaned under someone's weight, one step at a time. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. No one else had a key to the house, and my parents weren't coming home for hours. I listened, barely breathing, as the steps moved from one side of the room to the other. Then they stopped. Silence filled the space, thick and suffocating. Then the footsteps began again, heading for the stairs this time. Each step groaned under something heavy, something deliberate. I knew I had to move, to run, to do something, but I couldn't. I just sat there, paralyzed, watching the door to the stairwell like it might burst open at any second. The steps reached the last stair, and the house fell into complete silence again. For a moment, everything stood still, and then, from the other side of the door, I heard her voice low, almost playful. I asked if you were alone. He was there again, at the edge of the hallway, staring at the camera like he knew exactly where I was. Martin, the night janitor, had been giving me an uneasy feeling for weeks. At first, I tried to brush it off. The night shift at the corporate office was usually boring, with no one around except Martin, quietly shuffling from floor to floor. But there was something strange about the way he moved, like he appeared in places before he should have had time to get there. I'd spot him on the monitors, just standing still for minutes at a time, facing the camera, not blinking. Then the screen would cut out for a second, and when it flickered back on, he was gone. No sound, no trace, just gone. One night, I saw him again on the monitors, heading toward the basement. That was off limits. No one was supposed to go down there. It was just a storage space for old office junk. Empty filing cabinets, broken printers. The door stayed locked, always. But there he was, slipping through the basement door, as if it had been waiting for him. I told myself to let it go, but something gnawed at me. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the sense that if I didn't follow him, I'd never stop wondering. So I grabbed my flashlight and the basement key, my pulse kicking up a little as I made my way down. The hallway leading to the basement felt longer than usual. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the air is pressing in on you. My footsteps echoed off the walls as I reached the basement door and saw it cracked open. I hesitated, but only for a moment. Then I pushed it open and stepped inside. The darkness down there wasn't normal. It swallowed my flashlight beam, leaving only a sliver of light on the damp concrete floor. The walls felt closer than they should have been, like they were leaning in, waiting for me to get just a little deeper. That's when I saw it. A shelf had been moved slightly, revealing a door behind it. A door that wasn't supposed to exist. My breath caught in my throat. Every part of me told me to turn back. But I had to know. I slid the shelf aside and opened the door. Inside was a small room, and it smelled like iron and rot. My flashlight flickered as it illuminated what was inside. Small, personal items scattered across the floor. A child's drawing, a pair of glasses, a photograph of a smiling family. And in the corner, something darker. Bones. Old, brittle, and stained with something I didn't want to think about. I stared at the photo. It was a family portrait, and there was Martin Younger standing stiffly beside a woman and two children. My heart raced as the flashlight flickered again, the beam dancing across the scattered remains. Then I heard it, the shuffle of a shoe on the concrete, just behind me. I spun around, and there he was, Martin. He stood in the doorway, his face twisted into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. The kind of grin you see on someone who knows something you don't. "This is where I keep the things I care about," he said, his voice low and measured. I felt frozen, my mind racing as he took a step toward me, closing the space between us. I tried to move, but my feet were rooted in place. The smell of the room, the weight of the air, it was all too much. Then something in me snapped. I bolted, shoving past him, my shoulders slamming into his thin frame. I didn't look back as I ran, just heard the heavy thud of his footsteps following close behind. The basement walls seemed to close in tighter, the darkness pressing against my skin. I hit the stairwell door and threw it open, my lungs burning as I raced up the steps. Martin's footsteps never faltered. I could feel him just behind me, too close, too steady, like he knew I wouldn't make it. I reached the security office and slammed the door behind me, locking it tight. My hands shook as I grabbed the phone and called the police, my words tumbling out in a breathless rush. When they arrived, Martin was gone. The room was still there, though, with everything inside, the bones, the photograph, the sick stench of something long forgotten. They searched the building for hours, but there was no sign of him. I quit that night. But sometimes, even now, I feel it, that heavy, pressing quiet that sinks into your bones. And every now and then, the cameras glitch, just for a second, long enough to make me wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting. I wish we hadn't gone to that lake. If Mark hadn't talked me into it, if we just stayed at the campsite. But now, I can't close my eyes without seeing him standing there. It was supposed to be a peaceful fishing trip. Just me and Mark, no phones, no work. The lake sat in the middle of nowhere, hidden from the main roads, untouched by the noise of the world. We got there just as the sun was setting, painting everything gold and orange, and the water looked like glass, perfectly still. At first, it was everything we hoped, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the only person left on Earth. We cast our lines, waiting for the fish to bite, watching the sky turn darker by the minute. But as the last bit of daylight slipped behind the trees, we saw him. He stood on the far shore, perfectly still. At first, we thought it was another fisherman, though he had no rod, no gear. Just a man, standing ankle-deep in the water, watching us. Mark gave a nervous chuckle. "Guess we aren't the only ones who know about this spot," he whispered. But something about the way the man stood, so rigid, so intent, made my skin crawl. We waved. He didn't wave back. He just watched. The light faded, and soon the man was nothing more than a shadow among shadows. We kept fishing, though every few minutes, I found myself glancing toward that shore, trying to make out his shape. He never moved, not an inch. When the night thickened and the air grew colder, we decided to head back. We rowed in silence, our paddles cutting through the still water. Neither of us mentioned the man on the shore, but I knew we were both thinking about him. At the campsite, we built a fire to chase away the chill creeping into our bones. Mark tried to make small talk, but every sound beyond the flickering light, the snap of a twig, the brush of leaves, set us on edge. I don't know how long we sat there before it started, the soft tapping against the outside of our tent. Mark looked at me, his face pale in the firelight. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon, maybe the wind. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate tapping, like fingertips drumming against the fabric. Mark grabbed the flashlight, unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. There was no one there, just damp earth and pine needles underfoot. But then we saw them, footprints, bare, wet, and leading away from the lake straight to our tent. We didn't sleep after that. We packed our things in silence, throwing everything into our bags without care. The fire was still burning when we abandoned the campsite, running through the dark woods like something was chasing us. When we reached the car, Mark threw it into gear, and we sped down the gravel road, the tires kicking up dust and stones. Neither of us spoke until we hit the highway, the lake, and the woods a distant memory, At least that's what we told ourselves. I haven't been back since, and Mark won't talk about that night. But sometimes, when I'm lying awake, I can still feel the weight of that man's gaze. And in the quiet moments, I hear it, that soft tapping just outside my window. We found the door on the first night, a narrow, crooked thing hidden behind a tangle of old coats at the far end of the hallway, a door that wasn't in the house listing. Moving in had been a whirlwind, and Gianna and I were exhausted but excited. The two-story Craftsman home was everything we'd hoped for. Charming, with a big porch, warm wooden floors, and plenty of space. It felt perfect, at least at first. But when we pulled the coats aside and found that little door, something shifted. The space behind it wasn't even a real room, just a small, cold alcove with bare walls and an uneven floor. It smelled faintly of damp wood and something else, something sour. We stepped inside only for a moment, but that was enough. The air in there was too heavy, and the walls seemed too close together, pressing inward. It felt wrong. We shut the door and told ourselves we'd just leave it be. The first night passed quietly enough, but as the days went on, strange things began to happen. Footsteps, light, almost gentle, creeping through the hallway at night. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then we started hearing them every night, always at the same time. And then there were the doors. Every morning, one or two would be open, just slightly. Closet doors, the pantry, the bathroom cabinet, doors we knew we had shut. Gianna tried to laugh it off, calling it the house getting to know us. But I could see the tension in her face. The nights grew worse. I would wake up to the soft creak of floorboards just outside our bedroom, the slow scrape of feet dragging across the wooden floor. Each night, it felt like the footsteps got closer, stopping just before the bedroom door. Then came the night I woke to find Gianna sitting up, frozen, staring toward the hallway door. "There's someone standing there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I followed her gaze, heart pounding, and there was a figure, just beyond the doorway, a shape darker than the shadows around it. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It only stood there, watching. We didn't sleep that night. In the morning, we decided we couldn't ignore it anymore. Something in the house had shifted the moment we found that door, and whatever we'd let out, we needed to face it. We made our way to the narrow door at the end of the hall, holding hands as if that would somehow protect us. When we opened it, the little room felt colder than ever, the air thick and stagnant. We knew something was waiting. The figure was there again. This time, it didn't stay in the shadows. It stepped forward, revealing itself in the dim light. It wasn't just a shadow. It was us. Two versions of us, pale and silent, standing perfectly still. Their faces slack, their eyes empty mirrors of our own. And in that moment, I understood they weren't trying to harm us. They were waiting for us. I grabbed Gianna's hand and did the only thing I could think of. I whispered, "Leave." And somehow they did. The figures faded, slowly, as if retreating into the walls. The cold in the room lifted. For the first time in days, the house felt quiet. We sealed the door that night, hammering it shut, and the footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. But I still feel it sometimes when I walk past the end of the hall, a chill brushing the back of my neck, as if something is waiting, just in case we open the door again. When you're working the night shift in a place that big, it feels like the walls stretch farther with each hour. The warehouse where I worked wasn't new, and it made all the usual noises, metal racks groaning under weight, air ducts humming. It was never silent, not entirely, but there were moments when the noise dipped just enough for something else to sneak in. At first, it was small things. A clink of metal tools where no one should have been. A shuffle of feet down an empty aisle. I told myself it was my imagination. Exhaustion can make shadows stretch too far, and silence can play tricks. But those tricks became harder to ignore the longer I stayed. It started with the lights. One by one, rows of overhead bulbs would flicker and hum, like something was moving just ahead of me. I tried not to think about it. I kept walking, kept doing my rounds. But every night, it got worse, more deliberate. Then came the sound of footsteps. I heard them between the racks, soft at first, then heavier, like someone following a step behind. I'd spin around, flashlights sweeping over rows of silent metal shelves, but there was never anyone there. Just empty aisles stretching into the dark. One night, I checked the cameras, hoping to find some proof. What I found instead made my stomach drop. There was something on the screen, a figure, blurred and out of focus, moving slowly between the shelves. Its steps were too smooth, too steady, as if it knew exactly where it was going. The image glitched, and when the feed returned, the figure was gone. No trace. I sat frozen in front of the monitor, feeling my pulse throb in my throat. And then on another screen, I saw it again. This time it wasn't just wandering. It was making its way toward the basement. Nobody went into the basement, not unless you had a reason, and no one ever had a good reason. It was a dead space, filled with broken equipment and things better left forgotten. I should have stayed in the office. I should have turned off the cameras, looked the other way. But I grabbed my flashlight, and before I knew it, I was descending the narrow metal staircase that led down into the basement. The air down there was stale, thick with dust. My flashlight flickered as I moved deeper into the maze of old shelves and forgotten crates. Every corner I turned, I felt that cold prickle at the back of my neck, the sense that I wasn't alone. And then I saw it, a door that shouldn't have been there. It was set into the far wall, half hidden behind a stack of broken pallets. I hesitated for a long moment, my heart pounding so hard it made my hands tremble. But I had to know what was behind it. If I didn't open it, I knew I'd never sleep again. The door creaked open, and inside wasn't what I expected. It wasn't equipment or storage. It was a small room, and it looked lived in. There were blankets on the floor, empty cans stacked in a corner, and a row of photographs pinned to the wall, all of them of the warehouse. And at the center of the room, lying neatly on a blanket, was a collection of employee ID cards. My own face stared back at me from the top of the pile. I felt the hair on my arms rise, a chill running down my spine. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to find this. And that's when I heard it, the quiet scrape of metal on concrete, just outside the door. I turned slowly, flashlight beam trembling as I swung it toward the doorway. There, in the dim light, was the figure from the cameras. It stood perfectly still, blocking the way out. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see it smiling, a slow, deliberate smile, as if it had been waiting for me to join it all along. I didn't think. I ran. I shoved past it, sprinting down the narrow corridor, the sound of footsteps pounding behind me, matching my every move. I burst through the basement door, slamming it shut behind me. My chest heaved, breath ragged, as I twisted the lock. The footsteps stopped, but I knew it was still down there, waiting. I didn't clock out that night. I didn't even grab my things. I just ran, out of the building, into the night, not stopping until I was halfway home. I quit the next day, told them I couldn't come back. But even now, months later, I dream of that room. And in those dreams, I can hear it, footsteps, growing louder, coming closer. Because whatever was in that basement, it hasn't finished with me yet. Hey there, don't forget to like the video and subscribe.